The bear was drowning, begging for help. What this man did next will leave you in shock. A battered pickup truck rumbled to a stop along the banks of the Kenai River in south-central Alaska. The driver, a solitary figure named Thomas "Tom" Alderwood, stepped out into the crisp air. Everything about the landscape spoke of wild majesty, towering evergreens, rocky banks, and the glimmering water rushing by. But the magic of that moment shattered when he heard frantic splashing and a primal roar of distress echo across the river. Peering through the mist rising from the cold water, Tom realized with a jolt that a bear, a powerful symbol of Alaskan wilderness, was drowning. Little did he know, saving it would change his life forever. The Kenai Peninsula in Alaska has always attracted wanderers, dreamers, and those seeking a quiet refuge from the bustle of civilization. Stepping into its pristine valleys and by the clear waters of its rivers can feel like stepping back in time to a primordial place where nature's raw power prevails. The Kenai River, renowned among fishing enthusiasts for its salmon runs, cuts through the heart of this land. It is a place of drama and splendor, tall mountains blanketed in snow for most of the year, cedar and spruce trees that whisper in the wind, and meadows bursting with fireweed, lupines, and wild grasses in short but glorious summers. Tom Alderwood had chosen this remote outpost for reasons deeply personal. For years, he'd carried the weight of a turbulent past. A decorated former search and rescue operative in the Coast Guard, he had retired early after a disastrous mission claimed the lives of 2 teammates. Racked with guilt, Tom retreated from the life he once knew, friends, family, and the open sea he had loved. His soul-searching journey brought him to these Alaskan wilds, where the quiet hush of the forest and the untamed rivers offered him a strange kind of solace. Yet, living alone in a battered cabin about 20 miles from Soldotna was hardly restful. While the natural setting offered him an escape from the crowds and noise, Tom's mind was far from quiet. Nights often found him lying awake, listening to the distant howls of wolves or the gentle dripping of melting snow outside, staring at the rough wooden ceiling and wishing for a reprieve from the invasive memories. He filled his days with basic survival tasks, chopping wood, hunting for small game, fishing for salmon when in season. These tasks grounded him. They gave him a routine, a reason to focus on the present instead of the past. During the nights, especially in winter, the northern lights would sometimes shimmer across the sky. Green, purple, and yellow curtains of light danced overhead, reminding Tom of nature's grandeur and, ironically, of his own insignificance. On such nights, he felt a surge of yearning for purpose, for redemption, for a chance to feel alive again. He had saved lives as a Coast Guard rescue swimmer, but now he spent his days avoiding even the smallest sign of conflict or danger. The wilderness felt like his confessor, each unspoken tension reverberating in the calls of ravens circling overhead. He had visited Kenai River many times to fish or simply to look at the water. His cabin's only neighbor was a weather-beaten old fisherman named Duke, who lived 2 miles upstream. Duke occasionally stopped by with stories of big fish or rumors of bear sightings. Once or twice, he invited Tom out for a canoe ride, but Tom usually declined. While the water once felt like home to him, it was also the place where his ghosts from the Coast Guard mission roamed the strongest. Little did Tom know that one bright, cool morning would force him to confront those ghosts in a way he never anticipated. That day, the wind carried a certain electricity, as if nature sensed the drama about to unfold. The sunrise was brilliant, and the fish leaped at the surface of the river. The smell of spruce in the crisp air was invigorating, and the beams of golden light that filtered through the trees promised something extraordinary. Tom loaded up his old pickup, he used to joke it was older than he was, and set off along the winding road that followed the contours of the Kenai River. He hadn't even finished his first cup of coffee when fate stepped in. Before the events of that morning fully took shape, Tom had spent the past few weeks in a mental tug-of-war. On one side stood his abiding sense of duty. He had joined the Coast Guard in his 20s because of a desire to help others, to step into the line of danger so that others might be saved. On the other side loomed a colossal fear, a fear born from the catastrophic mission that ended in tragedy. That mission had gone wrong in every possible way. Engine failures, harsh weather, miscommunication. He watched in horror as he failed to save 2 dear friends and colleagues from a sinking vessel, and the memory haunted him night and day. At times, Tom felt convinced he'd never be able to trust himself again in a crisis. He second-guessed every decision, replaying scenarios in his head about how he could have done things differently. Simple choices, like where to place a foot while hiking, or how to hold a fishing rod, or whether to venture into a kayak on calm waters, became excruciatingly complex. Each moment carried the weight of potential danger, and each potential danger carried the risk of failure. When it came to the simple act of fishing, though, he found fleeting relief. Standing at the river's edge with his line cast into the swift currents, Tom felt a semblance of peace. It allowed him to focus on a primal, almost meditative task. The swirl of water around his waders became a hypnotic lull, lulling him into a state where the clamor of guilt momentarily quieted. During those fishing expeditions, Tom would occasionally spot grizzlies or black bears lumbering along the shoreline. He always gave them a wide berth, carefully respecting the boundary between human and beast. He found a strange camaraderie with these bears. Both he and the creatures knew the bounties and perils of the wild. The bears searched for salmon in the cold waters, sometimes scoring a feast, sometimes returning to the forest empty-handed. Tom understood that feeling. Yet on this particular day, as he drove along the road by the Kenai River, Tom had no inkling that he would soon face a test of courage unlike anything he had experienced since his Coast Guard days. He might have turned the truck around if he sensed it, might have tried to avoid the confrontation altogether. But life has a way of pushing us toward the challenges we most fear, precisely when we least expect it. Maybe that's how it was meant to be, how redemption quietly enters our lives unannounced, urgent, leaving us no time to back out. He rounded a bend in the road, the early morning light casting elongated shadows of the tall pines. It was then he heard something that made his heart lurch. A deep roaring echoed from the river, unlike the normal calls or grunts of a bear. This was a sound of pure panic, primal, desperate, and bristling with raw fear. Tom slammed on the brakes. His tires skidded on loose gravel, and dust spiraled around his truck. He shut the engine off, hopped out, and strained to see through the thick stand of trees that partially obscured his view. For a few seconds, he couldn't make out anything. The sound had faded. Then the bear's roar came again, more urgent this time. Tom's heart thumped heavily, and a slight trembling ran through his limbs. The last time he heard such desperation was during rescue missions at sea, hearing men cry out in the darkness. Memories threatened to flood him, but he forced himself to focus on the present, to push the door of his truck open and moved toward the sound. Gravel crunched beneath his boots, and the smell of wet pine drifted around him. The adrenaline that had lain dormant for so long began to surge. When he parted the branches and got his first glimpse of the riverbank, what he saw made his stomach clench in alarm. At the edge of the rushing water, a bear cub scrambled on slick stones, and some 30 feet away, an adult bear, likely the cub's mother, was flailing in the torrent. Her head bobbed below the surface, then reappeared with a colossal spray of water and an anguished roar. The swift current was dragging her downstream, closer to the deeper middle of the river, where swirling eddies threatened to pull her under. 1,000 questions collided in Tom's mind. Had the mother ventured too far in pursuit of fish? Had she slipped on a submerged rock? Or was there a hidden undertow dragging her into the depths? Whatever the reason, the bear was in mortal danger too far from the shore, in water that was punishingly cold and powerful. If she disappeared beneath the surface for even a few seconds too long, she might not resurface at all. Then, almost instinctively, Tom's training kicked in. He could see in a flash where the safest approach might be, how the current ran, where the eddies spun. He saw the path along the rocky bank that might give him a vantage point to reach the bear. He recognized, with a speed born of countless hours of rescue drills, that time was running out. But this was a bear, not a human. Rational thought told him that interfering could be extremely dangerous. Even a distressed bear could lash out with lethal force. This was not his mission. It shouldn't be his problem. And yet that cry had triggered something deep within him, an instinct to save, to pull a living being out of certain death. One look at the cub, its eyes wide and frantic, sealed the deal. Tom felt that if he stood there and let nature run its course, he would never forgive himself. Something more than guilt drove him now. It was compassion, a deep sense of empathy that transcended species or rational boundaries. The mother was drowning, and the cub was helpless. Over the wild swirl of water, Tom could hear his own heartbeat, pounding like a warning drum. But as he unzipped his jacket, tossing it onto the rocks, and stepped carefully toward the river, he knew there was no turning back. The Kenai River is known for powerful currents, especially during spring and early summer, when snowmelt swells its flow. Even the strongest swimmers must tread carefully. Tom knew that if he entered the water at the wrong point, the force of the river could sweep him away, leaving them both doomed. He crept along the shoreline, each step carefully calculated. The slick moss covering the rocks made it easy to slip and break an ankle, or worse. Meanwhile, the bear, a large female with a dark brown coat, continued to thrash about, losing ground inch by inch to the unrelenting current. The cub on the shore whimpered, paced, and occasionally let out a high-pitched cry that shattered the morning quiet like glass. It glanced at Tom with a mixture of fear and hope, as though sensing he might be its mother's only chance. Tom tried to keep his movements slow and deliberate, not wanting to spook the cub or the mother if she happened to glance his way. A distressed bear could be extremely dangerous, but a mother bear in survival mode? That was a gamble on a whole new level. Still, there was no time to question the risk. The mother's roars were becoming weaker, punctuated by desperate gasps for air. Tom found a partially submerged boulder near the spot where the current seemed strongest. From there, he had a better angle on the bear. She was only about 10 feet away, but that distance might as well have been a mile in these conditions. The water churned, rising to near chest level in the deepest places between him and the bear. Every second counted. He quickly scanned the river for anything he could use: branches, driftwood, or a sturdy rock that might help him brace himself. All he saw was the swirling mass of water, carrying debris, sticks, and bits of foam. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. His Coast Guard training roared back to life, adrenaline pumping through his veins like a shock of lightning. He forced his mind to block out the fear. Fear was a familiar companion, but in rescue operations, it was something you acknowledged, then set aside to focus on the job. He stepped off the boulder, feeling the icy water rush around his thighs, then his waist, and finally swirl around his chest. Its coldness stabbed at him, constricting his lungs, but he moved forward with grim determination. Easy. Easy, he muttered, half to himself, half in a voice meant to calm the flailing creature. He extended his arms, the current making it feel as though he were pushing through wet cement. The bear's eyes rolled in panic. She sucked in a mouthful of water, coughed and roared weakly. Tom felt the swirl of current tugging at his legs, trying to knock him off balance. One misstep could send him plunging downstream. Yet he pressed on. He reached within a couple of feet of the bear, close enough to see the terror in her eyes. Her massive paws slashed at the water, sending sprays into Tom's face. He had to time this perfectly. If the bear grabbed him or swiped at him, it might be over. But if she couldn't keep her head above water for a moment longer, she would drown regardless. With a steeled mind and unwavering focus, Tom lunged, wrapping one arm under the bear's neck in a makeshift hold, much like he'd done countless times with human victims in the ocean, but on a far more imposing scale. Instantly the bear bucked and jerked, nearly pulling Tom under. He fought the urge to recoil. Instead, he tightened his grip, hooking his legs around a submerged rock to anchor himself. The current hammered them both, and for a moment it felt like an underwater tug-of-war with the unstoppable force of the river. Every muscle in Tom's body strained, and his lungs burned as water splashed into his mouth. In the haze of chaos, he remembered critical rescue protocols. Keep the victim's mouth and nose above water. Keep moving laterally towards safety. Control panic. But how do you control the panic of a wild bear? Still, he did what he could. Every second had to be fought for. Slowly, he navigated sideways, inch by inch, refusing to surrender to the current. The bear's roars turned to rasping whimpers as she gulped for air. Tom's boots slipped on the algae-coated stones beneath the surface, and for a heart-stopping moment, they both sank. Ice-cold water rushed over Tom's head, and he swallowed a mouthful before kicking up with all his might. His head broke the surface again, and he gasped for oxygen, blinking river water out of his eyes. The bear seemed almost unconscious now, her powerful body gone limp with exhaustion. Mustering everything he had left, Tom angled them toward a small, calmer eddy behind a boulder. He found a foothold, then a second. He pushed off, half swimming, half dragging the bear along. Bit by bit, the roar of the main current grew distant. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Tom's foot found solid ground near the shoreline. He stumbled, coughed, and nearly went down, but somehow managed to keep the bear's snout above the water. The cub was squealing frantically, darting back and forth on the rocks. Tom made the last few steps toward the riverbank, muscles burning, heart hammering in his chest, adrenaline roaring in his ears. With one final surge, he heaved the massive bear upward onto the rocks, letting her body slump onto the pebbled shore. Then he collapsed beside her, chest heaving, arms trembling. The world spun. He tasted blood. He must have bitten his lip in the struggle. Cold air stung his face, but it was better than water, filling his lungs. For a few terrifying seconds, the mother bear lay motionless, except for a faint rise and fall of her torso. Then, slowly, she coughed up water, a sound that emerged like a deep, guttural retch. Tom scrambled back, giving the animal space. He watched as she wheezed, coughed again, and finally lifted her head. Her eyes latched onto Tom, wide with bewilderment or fear, or perhaps a glimmer of recognition that this man had somehow prevented death from swallowing her. The cub bounded forward, sniffing its mother, letting out plaintive little noises. Tom couldn't believe he was still alive, that he had just yanked a drowning bear from the clutches of a raging river. Drops of water trickled from his hair and clothes, pooling around his boots. He braced himself, anticipating the mother might react with aggression. Instead, what happened next was beyond anything he could have imagined. Tom pushed himself upright, fighting the urge to slump back down on the wet rocks. Every muscle in his body protested, but he knew he had to be on guard. A mother bear, especially one that has just experienced a life or death struggle, is not an animal to be taken lightly. If her maternal instincts kicked in with Tom too close, she might view him as a threat to her cub. Yet, He couldn't tear his eyes away from the scene unfolding before him. The mother bear remained on her side, panting and trembling in the aftermath of her brush with death. Her massive chest heaved up and down as she fought to replenish her lungs with oxygen. The cub nudged her face, whining softly, then scampered around her body, as though trying to assess if she was truly okay. Tom watched with a mixture of awe and caution. He was so close to these wild creatures that he could see every detail: the thickness of the mother's fur, the dark pads on the cub's paws, and the steam rising from their soaked coats into the chilly morning air. He carefully rose to his feet, keenly aware of how easily this situation could turn dangerous. Waves of adrenaline still coursed through him, making his hands shake and his knees unsteady. In the Coast Guard, he carried out plenty of rescues under extreme circumstances, but never had the victim possessed claws and teeth strong enough to rend flesh in a single swipe. Tom wiped a trickle of blood from his split lip, wincing at the sting. The cold air was starting to seep into his bones, making him painfully aware of his drenched clothing. Despite the countless alarms sounding in his mind, telling him to retreat, Tom took a cautious step forward. The mother bear's eyes flicked to him, and a deep rumble rose from her throat. Not quite a growl, but a warning. Tom froze. He lifted his hands slowly, palms outward in a universal gesture of "I mean no harm." The last thing he wanted was to provoke an attack. The bear stared at him for a tense moment. Tom could almost hear his own heart pounding. Then, just as slowly, she lowered her head back onto her paws, the rumble subsiding. The cub let out a squeaky sound, half whimper, half chirp, as if acknowledging Tom's presence. Careful not to overstay his welcome, Tom began backing away, step by step, until he was a safe distance. He knew the mother would need time to recover, to regain her strength. In that moment, a wave of emotion crashed over him. He felt relief that he was still alive. He felt awe at having come so close to a powerful creature and lived to tell the tale. And he felt a peculiar warmth in his chest, a glimmer of something he had lost a long time ago, the unspoken joy of saving a life. It dawned on him that he was shivering uncontrollably. The icy water, combined with the adrenaline crash, left his teeth chattering and his limbs shaking. He needed to change into dry clothes before hypothermia set in. For a moment he considered taking one last glance at the mother bear, but she had closed her eyes. The cub was snuggled against her, as though guarding her while she recovered. It was a tender, even heartbreaking scene. Part of him wanted to stay and make sure they were safe, but logic dictated he do otherwise. He had done what he could. Tom turned around and made his way to his truck, which, thankfully, hadn't rolled away or been approached by the mother bear. Once inside, he peeled off his wet shirt and dug into the duffel bag on the passenger seat for a spare sweater and pants. His hands were shaking so badly that it took him several tries to unzip the bag. Finally, he managed to pull on the dry clothes, though he could still feel the cold radiating from within. He started the engine, cranked the heat up, and sat there for a few minutes, letting the hot air blow over him. His mind was whirling in 100 directions. Was the bear going to recover fully? Would she be able to care for her cub? Should he call the wildlife authorities to notify them of a distressed animal? But the Kenai wilderness was vast, and nature usually found a way to heal itself. His experience taught him that only in extreme cases such as an orphaned cub or an obviously injured animal did rangers intervene. The adrenaline surging through his bloodstream began to ebb, replaced by a weird emptiness. He recognized it as the aftermath of a high-stress rescue, something he used to experience often but had not felt for a long time. It was as if his entire being had been poised to fight for survival, and now that the fight was over, a hollow, shaky feeling crept in. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the bear or the cub. Of course, they weren't there. He'd driven up a slight incline to park at a safer vantage point. Instinct pushed him to go back, to check on them, to ensure they were truly out of immediate danger. but a voice inside reminded him the mother bear could react aggressively now that she was on land, regaining her strength. The rescue was over. The best thing he could do was let them be. Still, he couldn't drive away. Something deep and powerful rooted him to the spot. Perhaps it was the ghost of the guilt he'd carried from that failed Coast Guard mission. Perhaps it was the simple, undeniable fact that he had just saved a life, an act that tied him back to the person he once was. He was no longer the man who just ran from memories of the ocean. He was Tom Alderwood, rescuer, even if his patient this time had been a wild bear. After letting the heater run for another 5 minutes, Tom switched the engine off. The hum of the pickup died away, replaced by the hush of the forest. Distant caws of ravens reached his ears, and overhead a pair of eagles soared, scanning the river for fish. Gathering his courage, Tom grabbed a wool blanket from the back seat and tucked it around his shoulders. He forced himself to stand, ignoring the aches that shot through his muscles. Quietly, he made his way back down to the edge of the river, following the same path he had taken before. The scene he found almost made him gasp. The mother bear had managed to sit upright, her thick, damp fur glinting dully in the muted morning light. The cub was by her side, pressing its small body against her flank as if to reassure both her and itself. When Tom approached, she fixed her gaze on him. There was a moment of tension, that primal standoff between man and beast. But she didn't growl, didn't bare her teeth. She simply looked at him with a mix of caution and weary acceptance, as though acknowledging his role in what had just transpired. Tom kept a respectful distance. "You're all right," he murmured softly, though he knew she couldn't understand his words. "You're safe now. Take care of your little one." Her ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but she made no move to charge or retreat. It was an encounter he would never forget, two apex species locked in a silent exchange. Finally, Tom turned to go. The mother bear lowered her head and began licking her cub, maybe to calm it, maybe to assure it that everything was going to be okay. The gesture filled Tom with a deep sense of peace and wonder. Life in the wilderness could be harsh, but it also held moments of profound tenderness and connection. Little did he know that this extraordinary rescue was just the beginning of a chain of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself, about fear, and about the extraordinary bond that can sometimes form between man and nature. Driving away from the river that day felt like leaving a part of his old identity behind. In saving the bear, Tom had tapped into the reservoir of courage and skill he once possessed in abundance as a Coast Guard rescue swimmer. It was a part of himself he had buried, convinced it was better left dormant after the tragedy that ended his career. But today it had sprung forth as though no time had passed, and that realization shook him. He returned to his cabin, a simple one-room structure with a loft overhead for sleeping, nestled among towering spruce trees. The place felt both comforting and suffocating in its familiarity. Wooden walls hung with practical items like snowshoes and fishing gear, a small wood-burning stove near the center, and a modest kitchen area with a sink and a propane-powered stove. Outside, a half-chopped pile of firewood beckoned. In the corner, Duke's old rocking chair squeaked in the breeze that slipped through the gaps around the doorframe. Tom hung up his soaked jacket and waders on pegs near the entrance. He toweled off as best he could and changed into his warmest clothing, thick wool socks, flannel pants, and a fleece hoodie. His body still trembled, but now it was more from the lingering shock than the cold. His mind was relentless, replaying the moment when the bear was nearly swallowed by the river. He could see her thrashing, hear her roars and the rushing water. He could feel the desperate pounding of his heart as he clung to her and fought the current. Yet in those moments, he hadn't been paralyzed by fear. Instead, he had acted. He made a pot of coffee, strong and black, and sipped it while gazing out the window. Patches of afternoon sunlight glinted off the trees, making the forest look almost ethereal. He wondered how the bear and her cub were faring now. Was she strong enough to walk? Had they found shelter somewhere nearby? A pang of concern knotted his stomach. He was no wildlife expert, but he did know that a bear recovering from such an ordeal might need time to regain strength before it could successfully hunt or scavenge. He reminded himself that nature had its own rhythms of healing, and that intervening further might do more harm than good. Tom's thoughts drifted to the phone number for the local fish and game office, pinned to a bulletin board near the door. Should he report the incident? If the bear was injured, they might decide to tranquilize her and bring her to a rehabilitation center. But then again, if she was just exhausted, they might do nothing except monitor. Tom was torn. In the Coast Guard, everything was structured. There were protocols, standard operating procedures, debriefings, and after-action reviews. Out here in the wilderness, you acted on instinct, and the line between right and wrong was not always clear. He mulled it over until the coffee in his mug grew cold. Finally, he picked up the phone. The landline connection crackled, a common annoyance this far from town. After 3 rings, a gruff voice answered, "Alaska Department of Fish and Game, Kenai Peninsula office." Tom explained his story, omitting certain details like how closely he had physically intervened. He simply stated that he had come across a mother bear that appeared to be drowning, and that she had made it to shore but seemed exhausted. The man on the other end was polite but non-committal, stating that they'd keep an eye out for any reports of an injured bear, though it was unlikely they'd launch a search unless the bear posed a threat to humans or was found clearly incapacitated. Tom hung up, feeling an uneasy mixture of responsibility and relief. At least he'd done what he could. The rest, he told himself, was up to the wilderness. But he couldn't shake the sense that this event had stirred something deep within him, something that wouldn't just fade away. Night fell quickly in this part of Alaska, and the temperature dropped with the sun. Tom lit a fire in his stove, the crackling flames providing the only source of heat and comfort in the small cabin. He tried reading a well-worn paperback about Alaskan bush pilots, but his mind kept wandering. Sleep seemed impossible. Instead, he paced the length of the cabin, reliving the tension of the rescue and grappling with long-buried emotions. Eventually, exhaustion overcame him. He climbed the ladder to the loft and lay down on his small mattress, covered in a patchwork quilt. The wind picked up outside, howling around the eaves. Yet as he drifted into a fitful sleep, he felt a faint sense of victory. For the first time in a long while, he had done something heroic without letting fear strangle him. That glimmer of redemption felt fragile, but it was there, shimmering like a lantern in the distance. His dreams were a tangled mess, half-remembered rescue missions, swirling waters, the faces of his lost teammates. But there was also a presence that felt comforting, something large yet benevolent. He couldn't quite place it. When he finally woke, sweat clung to his brow and his heart pounded. He looked around the loft, disoriented in the dark, uncertain whether he was in a bunk on a Coast Guard cutter or in his cabin in the Alaskan wilderness. Slowly, reality seeped in the cabin walls, the quiet stove, the hush of the forest outside. He lay back down, breathing deeply. Strangely, he felt a small measure of peace. The dream had ended not in terror, as it usually did, but in a wash of relief. Perhaps the events of the day had begun to rewrite the script of his fears. Maybe he was at last finding a way to forgive himself. Days passed in a blur of everyday tasks, splitting wood, fixing small leaks in the cabin roof, doing some basic hunting and fishing. The weather oscillated between crisp sunshine and sudden showers. Through it all, Tom found his mind drifting often to the mother bear and her cub. Had they moved on to another area? Were they safe? One late afternoon, he decided to hike toward the ridge that overlooked the Kenai River. From there, He could get a panoramic view of the valley and the water snaking through it. He packed a small backpack with essentials, water, a sandwich, a lightweight first aid kit, and binoculars. He also strapped on a bear spray canister, knowing full well that while many bears steer clear of humans, it never hurt to be cautious. He followed a narrow trail that wound upward through dense forest, the smell of wet pine and decomposing leaves heavy in the air. Spruce needles blanketed the ground, muffling his footfalls. Occasionally, he caught glimpses of small critters, squirrels, marmots, and once a fox darting among the trees. The climb was steep in places, and Tom found himself breathing hard, but the mild discomfort made him feel alive and grounded in the present. When he reached the ridge, the view was nothing short of breathtaking. The Kenai River glittered in the distance, framed by rolling mountains whose peaks still bore caps of white. Clouds drifted overhead, casting shifting shadows on the forest below. Tom found a flat rock and sat down to eat his sandwich, letting the fresh air fill his lungs. He peered through his binoculars, scanning the riverbank. At first, all he saw were the tall pines swaying in the breeze and the occasional glint of water. But then his gaze locked onto something that made his heart skip a beat, a large shape moving slowly along the shore, followed closely by a smaller one. It was the mother bear and her cub. Tom's pulse quickened. From this distance, he couldn't be absolutely certain, but something told him it was them. The mother's gait seemed hesitant, and he noticed she paused, often as though fatigued. The cub stayed close, occasionally trotting a step or two ahead, but never straying far. Tom watched, transfixed. They were alive, at least, and moving. A surge of relief washed over him, a warmth in his chest that eclipsed the cold breeze. As he watched, the mother bear stopped and lowered her head to the water, possibly drinking or fishing. The cub did the same, mimicking her motions. After a few moments, they resumed their slow progress along the bank, heading in the direction of a shallow tributary that fed into the main river. Tom noticed that the mother still seemed unsteady, her steps uneven, but she was mobile, which was a good sign. He sat there for nearly an hour, eyes glued to the pair through the binoculars, a quiet awe settling over him. Something about witnessing them in their natural element, surviving despite the near tragedy, stirred a deep respect in him. Nature was brutal, yes, but also resilient. And in some small way, he'd contributed to that resilience. As the sun sank lower in the sky, Tom decided to make his way down. He felt an odd sense of closeness to those bears, as though they were tied to him by an invisible thread. Even if he never encountered them again, he would carry that bond with him, a reminder that redemption often arrives not in triumphant fanfare, but in small acts of courage that break the shackles of guilt. Yet fate had other plans. The next morning, while on a routine fishing trip at a calmer bend of the river, Tom heard a rustling in the undergrowth. He froze, scanning the trees for signs of movement. Then he saw them, the mother bear and her cub, emerging from a tangle of shrubs, perhaps drawn by the sound of the water or the scent of fish. Tom's heart thudded in his chest. He was only about 40 yards away. The river separated them, but that distance could evaporate in seconds if the bear decided to cross. He held his breath, ready to slowly back away, but something strange happened. The mother bear halted when she spotted him, sniffed the air, and then simply stood there. She didn't growl or show aggression. The cub peered curiously at Tom, head bobbing from side to side. For a long moment, they regarded each other. Tom felt no immediate threat. His instincts told him that if she perceived him as dangerous, she would have reacted already, snapped her jaws, growled, or sent the cub scurrying up a tree. Instead, she seemed calm, almost curious. It struck Tom as impossible that she recognized him as the human who had saved her. Yet, the way she lingered there suggested some sort of awareness. Slowly, Tom lowered his fishing rod, adopting a non-threatening stance. He said nothing, made no sudden movements. The cub took a few steps closer to the water's edge, sniffing at driftwood. Tom's breath caught in his throat. The mother bear let out a low, rumbling noise, not hostile, but more like a cautionary reminder to her cub. The youngster turned back to her side, chastened. Then, with a slow, deliberate pivot, the mother bear turned and guided the cub back into the undergrowth. Tom exhaled, realizing only then how taut his muscles had been. His mind whirled. The encounter could have ended very differently. He stared at the spot where they had vanished, a swirl of gratitude and wonder in his chest. He wondered if, on some instinctual level, the bear had recognized him. It was a foolish thought. Bears don't do gratitude in the human sense. Yet, part of him couldn't deny the possibility of some deeper, primal understanding passing between them. That chance meeting lingered in his thoughts all day. By evening, he had told himself 100 times that it was pure coincidence. Bears, like all creatures, follow water and food sources. But each time he recalled the way she had looked at him, the memory sent a shiver down his spine. He recalled stories he had heard from old Alaskan trappers about unusual bonds formed between humans and wild animals under extraordinary circumstances. Some were apocryphal, others possibly real. Maybe he and the bear now shared something that transcended logic, a fleeting connection formed at the brink of life and death. Over the next couple of weeks, Tom continued his daily routines, but carried a renewed sense of purpose. He found himself emerging from the shell he had built around his life. He was still cautious around people, still haunted by memories, but a spark of confidence glowed inside him. In small ways, he felt the old Tom Alderwood, returning the man who had once believed in the nobility of saving lives. One morning, he made a decision that might have seemed trivial to an outsider, but was monumental to him. He signed up to volunteer with a local search and rescue outfit that sometimes assisted hikers in the area. It took him nearly an hour to draft an email to the volunteer coordinator, explaining his background and what he hoped to contribute. The sense of fear in hitting the send button was almost paralyzing, but he did it anyway. No matter what happened, taking that step felt like reclaiming a part of himself. The days grew shorter as autumn advanced, painting the Alaskan foliage in shades of gold, orange, and red. Tom spent hours outside, soaking in the beauty of the land. He would sometimes wander along the riverbank, secretly hoping to catch another glimpse of the mother bear and her cub. He never ventured too close. He respected their space. Yet, each time he looked at the rushing waters of the Kenai, he felt a surge of pride and humility. Those waters had nearly taken the life of that bear, and in saving her, Tom had saved himself in a way. Letters and phone calls from old Coast Guard friends started to feel less threatening. He even phoned one of his closest buddies, Jake, whom he hadn't spoken to since the accident. The call was emotional and raw, but cathartic. Tom apologized for shutting everyone out, and Jake apologized for not pushing harder to stay in touch. They talked about the friends they had lost on that fateful mission. They cried, they laughed, and by the end, Tom felt a sense of release from the burden of guilt he had carried. He also began to notice the subtle transformations in his daily life. His sleep improved, with fewer nightmares and night sweats. His appetite returned, and he found pleasure in cooking small, hearty meals, stews, grilled fish, fresh berries when they were in season. He even tried his hand at baking sourdough bread, a skill he'd read about in a rugged homesteading guide. The bread didn't rise properly on his first attempt, but the process of kneading dough felt therapeutic. Some nights, he'd sit by the fire, the soft glow illuminating the wooden walls of his cabin. A battered journal lay open on a small table where he jotted down thoughts, sketches of the forest, and memories of that day by the river. He wrote about the rescue, capturing every detail he could recall: the bear's terrified eyes, the frothing water, the strain on his muscles, the exhilaration when they finally reached shore. As he wrote, He felt the final pieces of his old trauma unspooling, replaced by a new tapestry of gratitude and courage. By late autumn, the volunteer coordinator from the local search and rescue group, a woman named Sarah Wheeler, got back to him. She sounded enthusiastic about having someone with his background. They exchanged a few phone calls to discuss training exercises and scheduling. As he spoke with her, Tom felt the same rush of warmth he had experienced during the bear rescue. A door that had been shut for so long was now cracked open, allowing light to seep in. He threw himself into physical conditioning, determined to be fit enough to handle the rugged terrain. He ran modest distances through the forest, did push-ups and sit-ups by the cabin, and practiced carrying a loaded backpack on hikes up the ridge. Each sweat-filled session was a reminder of who he once was and who he could be again. One day, after finishing a run, Tom stumbled upon fresh paw prints in the mud near the riverbank. Larger than any he'd seen, he crouched down, pressing his hand to the indentations. They were huge, likely from a fully grown grizzly. His heart quickened. He scanned the tree line. No sign of the animal, but a deep sense of connection surged through him. He whispered a silent thanks, uncertain if it was for the bear he had saved, or for the wilderness that had helped him rediscover himself, or for the second chance at life that now glowed on the horizon. Maybe all three. As autumn wore on, warnings of an early winter storm crackled over the radio. The Kenai Peninsula braced for blinding snow and fierce winds. Tom spent days stacking firewood, stocking food, and making sure his truck was outfitted for emergencies. He sensed that this storm, like so many other trials, might test the fragile confidence he'd reclaimed. On the storm's second night, snow whipped at the windows and the wind groaned around the cabin. Tom was sipping hot tea, determined to wait out the weather, when his landline rang. It was Sarah Wheeler, the volunteer coordinator for the local search and rescue team. She spoke in clipped, urgent tones. 2 hikers were overdue from a short loop near Eagle Pass. Family had reported them missing just hours earlier. Tom's pulse quickened. Sarah asked if he could help. He was the closest, and the team needed someone ready to move as soon as the storm let up. Nervousness flared inside him, a grim reminder of past tragedies, but he heard himself say, "I'll do it." At daybreak, the storm tapered off, just enough for Tom to plow through half-buried roads to the trailhead. Wind still gusted, and drifts piled high, but he pushed on with snowshoes and a heavy rescue pack. The forest stood silent under a thick white shroud. Visibility was poor, and he called out repeatedly, his voice swallowed by the snow. An hour in, he spotted a red backpack protruding from a snowdrift. His stomach lurched. He dug it free and found scattered belongings, but no sign of the owners. Then he heard a faint moan on the wind. Following the sound, he discovered a young man half buried under a fallen branch. His lips were blue with cold, but he was alive. Tom unrolled a thermal blanket, pressed his own body heat against the man until he stabilized, then radioed Sarah. The signal crackled. Rescue snowmobiles were on their way, but it would be some time. With the man sheltered, Tom pressed on to find the other hiker. He soon found her clinging to a slippery ledge, tears frozen to her cheeks. If she fell, the drop was fatal. Tom crawled on his belly, secured a rope around a nearby tree, and reached for her. Her branch snapped just as he grabbed her wrist. They slid an agonizing few inches toward the edge before Tom's rope went taut, saving them both. He pulled her to safety, breath ragged from exertion. They hurried back to the makeshift shelter where the man shivered under blankets. Tom fumbled with his radio again, urging the rescue team to hurry. When the snowmobiles finally arrived, both hikers were whisked away for medical treatment. Exhausted and shaking with cold, Tom felt a quiet pride in having answered the call. He'd faced the whiteout, not run from it. In the gathering dusk, he trudged back to his truck. The world lay muffled in deep snow, but inside Tom, a powerful sense of purpose roared to life. For so long he doubted himself, questioned whether he deserved the title of rescuer. Yet as the storm winds died, he knew his heart had found its path again. It took hours for Tom to drive back to his cabin through roads thick with snow. By the time he arrived, darkness had draped the land, and the stars glittered fiercely overhead. The aurora borealis shimmered in green and violet ribbons on the horizon, as though celebrating a victory. Inside, he built up the fire, hung his snow-crusted gear to dry, and finally settled into a chair. His body ached from the day's exertions, but his heart was light. The search and rescue team radioed in once more to confirm the hikers were stable at a local clinic. They owed Tom an enormous debt of gratitude, but Tom brushed off the praise. He wasn't in it for the accolades. He was simply answering a call that had always been in his nature. In the subsequent days, the storm blew itself out, leaving a crystalline landscape of snow and ice. The temperatures plunged further, the nights long and dark. Tom found himself reflecting on the journey he had taken since that fateful morning when he first discovered the drowning bear. Had it really been only a short while ago? It felt like ages, as though his entire life had pivoted on that moment. News of his heroic rescue of the hikers spread through the small Alaskan community, and a local journalist even reached out for an interview. Tom politely declined. He didn't want the limelight. He had faced that kind of attention in his Coast Guard days, and it never felt comfortable. Besides, he understood that this was a private journey as much as anything else, a path of healing his own soul. One clear afternoon, when the sun's pale rays draped the snow-covered trees, Tom took a walk by the Kenai River. The water ran dark and cold, steam rising in places where the temperature contrast was greatest. Memories flickered in his mind, the frantic splashing, the roar of the bear, his own desperate struggle against the current. He gazed across the water, half hoping to see a familiar shape lumbering through the forest. The mother bear and her cub would likely be hibernating soon, if they hadn't already. He wondered where they were holed up, whether they remembered that day on the riverbank. And then, almost as if summoned by his thoughts, he spotted fresh tracks in the snow near the water's edge. Large prints, accompanied by smaller ones. His breath caught. It was late in the season, but not impossible for bears to be out if they hadn't fully denned up yet. He followed the tracks a short distance, heart pounding. They led to a cluster of cedar trees, then disappeared, as though the animals had taken to higher ground or found shelter in a thicket. He stood there, a lump in his throat. Overhead, a breeze rustled the branches, sending small tufts of snow cascading down. The silence of the wilderness enveloped him, and in it he felt a profound sense of connection, not just to the bear, but to everything around him. The struggles, the near drowning, the rescue, all seemed part of a larger tapestry, a dance of life in which every being has a role. In that hush, he spoke aloud, voice cracking with emotion. Thank you. Whether he was thanking the bear, the forest, or the river, he wasn't entirely sure. Maybe he was thanking them all, plus something greater, the nameless, timeless spirit of the wild that had guided him back to himself. For a moment, he felt a pang of sadness that the mother bear and her cub weren't right there to see him. But that was all right. Their story and his story would continue, each woven into the rhythms of Alaska's endless cycles of survival and renewal. He felt a deep peace in that understanding. With one last, lingering glance at the snowy trails, Tom turned and headed back toward his cabin. His footprints marred the pristine white of the snow, a reminder that man leaves a mark on the wilderness, just as the wilderness leaves a mark on man. For Tom Alderwood, those marks ran deep on his body, in his heart, and through every fiber of his being that now pulsed with renewed strength and love for life. And so ends the tale of a man and a drowning bear, a meeting on the edge of life and death that sparked courage, compassion, and redemption in a wounded soul. In the snowy wilderness of the Kenai Peninsula, Tom Alderwood discovered that sometimes the most profound acts of rescue aren't just about saving another's life, they're about reclaiming our own. Each step he took on that frozen path led him to a deeper understanding of fear, healing, and hope. Thank you for joining this journey through raging rivers, treacherous trails, and the boundless spirit of resilience. If this story moved you, if it made you hold your breath, cheer, or reflect on your own moments of bravery, please remember to like this video, share it with friends who might need a spark of inspiration, and subscribe for more tales of courage and transformation. Together, our stories can light the path toward hope for everyone.